Well, many arguments surrounding China's growth do point to ideology, with some citing the introduction of markets as a key driver. And I definitely think that that's part of the reason, but I think the full explanation's a bit more interesting. So, I will come back to markets because I certainly think they've been a benefit and very necessary. But to start with, I don't think it's unreasonable to state that China did have luck on her side to begin with. They had some very good natural geopolitical advantages upon which they could capitalise on. They had good proximity to rich neighbours, and they also had the good fortune of not being landlocked, and that allowed for the development of ports for trade routes across a vast coastline. We would also do well to keep in mind that China did begin industrialising after that of Europe and East Asia, and that gave them access to modern shipping, ever-growing globalisation, and modern innovations from across the world. They were able to combine this with a very large and low-wage workforce, easily able to undercut the industrialised nations as a reliable, cost-effective option. They could produce things cheaper than the industrialised nations could, and sure enough, businesses poured in. So, they would invest in China, and in return, China supplied them with low-wage workers. And for China, finding workers was not an issue. Even in 1979, China had a population just below 1 billion. The population was also disproportionately younger than that of the industrialised world. So that left them with a very large, able-bodied workforce able to meet the demand as it grew throughout the years. But important though luck is, it was in many ways just a sideshow. Without competent and pragmatic leadership, having all the resources and opportunity in the world amounts to nothing. Lest we forget that countries all over the world have, like China, had the resources at their disposal but were either plagued by economic mismanagement, corruption or other issues and would remain poverty-stricken nations. Leadership and competence in China would play a huge role. And after Chairman Mao's death in 1976, China's leaders in the 1970s had the humility to realise that what they were doing wasn't working. The country had suffered millions of casualties through radical policies and still in large part comprised of peasants, collective farms and mass poverty. But the important point here is that China's leadership had the humility to accept that they were indeed behind, and the willingness to learn from other nations, and they began sending officials out to various parts of the world: Eastern Europe, Hong Kong, Japan, and Western Europe. Here's a quote from the book Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China. From their visits to factories, farms, and science and technology units, the group returned home with some concrete suggestions about what China might do. But more importantly, after the trip, Chinese leaders stopped calling Yugoslavia revisionist, the derogatory term Mao had used to criticise the departure of socialist countries from the path of socialism. This was because China's leadership were thinking more pragmatically and less ideologically. Officials were instructed to conduct detailed investigations and research into what they saw and what ideas could be used. In doing this, they created a convergence of evidence to support their own future steps. What they sought to achieve was strong and sustained growth, to bring them in line with the capitalist countries in the industrialised world. But Deng Xiaoping was firm. The order of the day was to learn. As he states, "We ought to study the successful experiences of capitalist countries and bring them back to China." This meant, in effect, market reforms. And that was okay, as long as it wasn't called that, of course. But the reality was, a central planned economy was shifting more to a market-based one. But Deng could see that it was absolutely necessary. Summarising the trip in 1978, Deng commented, "The more we see, the more we realise how backward we are." The train of opportunity would soon be leaving, however, and China did not want to be left behind. But as to how they would proceed with these reforms was another matter. They had a choice. They could either go with a shock therapy approach and transition their economy quickly, or they could take a more gradualist approach. Now, it should be worth noting here that the shock therapy approach was the approach adopted by the Soviets and many others. It was the consensus approach. It was backed by the IMF and anybody else who was considered intelligent at the time. But China didn't take it. Instead, they opted for the gradual approach. And this meant that the first initial reforms were trialled in cities and provinces, seeing what worked and what didn't, and how workers on the ground responded to the changes. I think a good example of China's approach here was how they dealt with fixed prices. They didn't simply move from fixed prices to market prices. They first opted for a two-tier price system. until they felt that the country was ready to move to market pricing. But this didn't mean that China weren't serious about their reforms. A clear example of this is their breaking up of collective farms and instead having masses of smaller farms, each managed by smaller groups of people. And this increased productivity and it led to a surplus, with the money being invested, as planned, into light manufacturing. So this meant that China could now begin actually producing small and simple items, things like textiles, making use of technology that had been tried and tested in other countries. Now, a byproduct of this was that China's population started to actually learn the necessary skills in these areas and expand them. Workers from the countryside were now also pouring into the cities and looking for work, and China was able to start moving on to heavy manufacturing, continuing to pioneer new ways to promote accelerated growth. However, I should probably leave a side note here, as even when the country had opened themselves up to global markets, they still had the good sense to protect industries they felt would not be suitable to compete with the outside world, and thus protected their more vulnerable industries. The government was cautious. They managed to keep control of interest rates, exchange rates, and made effective use of tariffs. So, I do think the leadership of China does deserve praise, as it certainly wouldn't have had the growth it had without their willingness to learn and adapt. They weren't thinking globally, they were thinking about China, and certainly improved China and that of the Chinese people's fortune. But, finally, I think there's another reason that is sometimes often overlooked, that weighs in on China's ability to succeed when so many others failed, and that is culture. In China, hard work and determination are looked upon highly, and it is expected that children will embrace the full potential of all their talents. The country has a proud tradition of this, and it's also a very old country. It dates back as far as records go, and for much of that time, at least until the Industrial Revolution came along, it enjoyed success as a dominant and proud power. It was only when the Industrial Revolution came along and China was initially slow to react that they got left behind, which in turn led to their domination and attempted conquest by other powers. Its people therefore shared a collective belief that they deserved to rise again as a power. So, to summarise, there's a number of things that China did right that led to their growth. They had good fortune initially, pragmatic leadership, and a unified culture. But as to what you'd call the ideology it happened under is hard to say. The country is still thought of as a communist state, and the CCP was founded upon the principles of Marxism-Leninism. This in essence is what Mao tried to establish at the state's inception, starting with the murder of over 500,000 political enemies with the anti-rightist campaign. This was followed by a series of disastrous policies which resulted in around 60 million people dead and a GDP per capita lower than most of Africa. China's growth therefore did not happen until Mao's ideas were rejected. Since his death, China has embarked on a new path. But Mao founded the state, and so people seldom speak against him in China, and this does affect the rhetoric Chinese leaders use. Some people believe China still to be a communist state to this day. Some think it's a capitalist state, and some think it's a fascist state, and it's easy to see where the ambiguity comes in. While it allows for the use of markets and free trade and commerce, it rejects democracy and freedom. But at the same time it has its own wolf culture, longer work hours than the West, practices nationalism and patriotism at home, and boasts a huge military budget. So I don't know really what you'd call China's ideology, but I do think it's a fascinating question to ponder nonetheless. Now, as for the future of China, I do think China will continue to grow, albeit a bit slower than prior decades. But they've learnt to adapt, and they're also a unified country, generally speaking. I know I'm simplifying massively there, given what goes on, but what I mean is that their state is not fragile, nor are there massive movements to overthrow it. Their infrastructure growth is massive. China can build a hospital in 10 days if they want to. Their high-speed rail lines stretch longer than the rest of the world combined. And despite the demographic trends and falling population predictions, China has been able to adapt, and if they're able to in the future, then that will stand them in good stead. But that's down to future leaders and decisions. In terms of their military, they may become an aggressive military power, particularly as they rise in dominance and prestige. And I say that fully aware that China is not known for being aggressive, but I think that's largely down to internal conflicts and past invasions. It's also had enshrined in its culture the notion that war is not a noble enterprise. But China is eyeing up Taiwan, and I do think a conflict there is highly likely. But for the time being, China can lay claim to a country that came from nothing in the 1970s to the second biggest economy in the world today. Alright, thanks for watching. Bye for now. Take care.